Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Managing springtime grazing is a subject we get a lot of questions about every year. In this chat, Dr. Katie Young is going to walk us through some tips for managing horses during changing grass conditions. If you have questions, please type them in the comments below and we'll address them as we go. Also, be sure to sign up for the drawing for an Easy Breathe grazing muzzle generously donated by our friends at Tough One. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Katie Young to get us started.
Thank you, Erin. And yes, this is the time that the grass is coming up and we have to start thinking about how we're going to manage this pasture grazing for our horses if we're lucky enough to have pasture grazing. So what I'm planning to go through is just the management tips for dealing with the spring flush of grass. So some of the considerations we need to think about for just the pastures is that this lush green grass can increase the risk of digestive disturbances, including colic, laminitis. Sometimes you may see loose manure, and in some situations, you may see horses that are trying to chew on wood. So we want to make sure that we recognize these issues and manage and feed to reduce the risks of digestive disturbances. So we got to recognize the changes in forages and then again, manage to help take care of our horses. We also, though, want to make sure we provide the nutrients that may be lacking in the forages. And finally, in some situations, there are appropriate supplements to help reduce the risk of adverse conditions for these horses that are sensitive. So starting out, why is green grass it can be such an issue? So the perils of green grass. Why does the fresh grass cause colic and or possibly laminitis in horses? Well, we want to go all the way back to thinking about, you probably had a little bit of this maybe in like 8th grade science. I know that's when I first learned about it, but basic plant metabolism. And I know you've all heard of photosynthesis, where plants use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to synthesize sugars. And that's what they do. They make sugars, and they make sugars, notice, with the sunlight. So when they have all the right conditions, sun, water, carbon dioxide, they make sugars. And then during the night, when the sun has gone down, the plants use those sugars to fuel their growth. And I don't know if this happened to you guys, but when I was a kid, we did a little study, again, I think in 8th grade science, and put a little plant in the window and put a little plant under the sink in the classroom. And the little plant in the window got green and leafy, and the little plant under, I feel so sad for that little plant, under the sink got really, really, really tall, but it was kind of white. It really wasn't green. And that is because the little plant under the sink could grow, but it couldn't photosynthesize. So it didn't have that nice chlorophyll. It got tall. And then after a little while, it actually died because, again, they make sugar in the sunshine and then they grow when the sun is down. So your pasture grass is doing the same thing. Now, the tricky thing is growth is more temperature sensitive than photosynthesis. So when it gets too cold, the plants may still be making sugars during the day in the sunlight, but in the night when the sun goes down, if it gets really chilly, like less than 40 degrees, those plants don't grow anymore. So when the plants are not growing, they're still making sugars in the day, but then they store the sugars because they're not fueling their growth. Warm season grasses tend to store those sugars as starch, and cool season grasses store their sugars as fructans. I'll give you a little bit more about fructans in a minute. But if you have long periods of these sunny, warm days and chilly nights, you can get a real buildup of the sugars of the storage forms in those plants, which lead to high levels of soluble carbs in the pasture grasses, which would be sugar, starch, and or fructans. And then along with that, amateur plants, which of course we see in the springtime, tend to be higher in soluble carbs overall compared to mature plants. And again, this buildup of stored carbs due to environmental conditions that are typical in the spring just adds more to the situation. So you just think about the, and we're in April now, so in some parts of the country, we are seeing these really nice warm days and very chilly nights. As a matter of fact, for me here in Kansas, we keep going from, 70 in the day, and then the next day it's 50 in the day and 30 at night. So this is just the time that pasture grasses can be pretty tricky for horses. So levels of these non-structural carbohydrates as high as 40% dry matter have been reported in certain grasses, depending on the environmental conditions at the time. So back to those fructans. What's a fructan? And if you've been paying attention to a lot of the literature and just talk about such things, you probably keep hearing about fructans, but there's a lot of times they're not good explanations of what are fructans. So definition, fructans are oligo or polysaccharides that include a short chain of fructose units with a terminal glucose molecule. That's great English, isn't it? Okay, so the fructose units, fructose and glucose are both sugars. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, fructose is a 5-carbon sugar. We eat those sugars in our human foods on a regular basis. So, and horses do too, but the fructans are chains of fructose units, and they do have a glucose, simple sugar molecule, as part of that chain. But the difference between fructans and typically starches are also a bunch of sugar molecules hooked together, primarily glucose. Now, starches are digested well in the horse's small intestine, broken down into their sugars. Sugars are absorbed in the bloodstream. Fructans, however, have a bond in that molecule that is not broken down in the mammalian small intestine. So fructans, unlike starches, pass almost completely undigested into the horse's hindgut, pass through the small intestine into the hindgut, where in the hindgut, instead of broken down by enzymes into sugars, they are fermented by the microbes in the hindgut. And that is actually similar to what happens to fibers, the fermentation in the hindgut. However, unlike the fiber carbs, which in the hindgut are broken down into volatile fatty acids, the fructans are fermented very similarly to overloads of sugar and starch in the hindgut. So when fructans, sugars, starches, the non-structural carbs are dumped into the hindgut, the microbes break them down in the fermentation, and instead of producing volatile fatty acids, such as happens with fibers, the fermentation of the non-structural carbs produce lactic acid and excess gas, which can cause acidosis in the hindgut. So when we see an overload of starch, sugars, fructans into the horse's hindgut, especially if it's a sudden change and sudden overflow into the hindgut, we get lactic acid and gas, and that can be a problem. So as I said on the previous slide, the cool season grasses store their sugars as fructans. Warm season grasses store their sugars more as starch. And those cool season grasses can actually store more fructans than the warm season grasses can store starches. So in general, the most risky green pastures in the spring are the cool season grasses versus the warm season grasses. And the cool season grasses include a lot of the grasses that we're familiar with horses. Brome is a cool season grass, orchard grass. Timothy is more of a cool season grass. The warm season grasses are more coastal Bermuda grass, and a lot of native prairie grasses are the warm season grasses. Okay, so that's kind of the background of why the lush grass can be a problem. But now let's talk a little more specifically about the digestive disturbances that can come along with this lush green grass. So the first one is colic. I think we're all familiar with colic. If you have a horse, you're probably familiar with colic. You've at least heard of it. Hopefully you haven't dealt with it. But why do horses tend to get colic from the spring green grass? Well, it kind of goes back to the same thing I was talking about with fructans, except it can be fructans or the sugars and starches when there's a large soluble carb or non-structural carb content of lush grass. When the grass is not introduced gradually, that large amount that's kind of a big change to the horse's gut can cause that rapid fermentation in the hindgut. And when that happens, again, that's usually due to the big change in the amount of soluble carbs in the hindgut. It upsets the balance of the microbial populations because in general, you have a lot of microbes that ferment fiber because that's the typical substrate in the hindgut. But when you get a bunch of non-structural carbs, then those microbes that ferment the non-structural carbs, their populations are able to expand. And because there are more and more of them fermenting the non-structural carbs, you see an increase in gas and lactic acid production from this fermentation. And that can cause disruption and discomfort in the horse's hindgut. So for some horses, the change from hay to lush pasture with the high fibrous going from the high fibrous content to the low fiber content can cause the intestinal upset. It may be more of a risk due to management with a sudden forage change, but environmental conditions can exacerbate the situation with weather patterns, temperature, and rainfall. And you think about it, and you're looking at your pasture, and it's gradually starting to green up. But if it's been really dry, that change is really slow. And then you suddenly get an onslaught of nice temperatures and a lot of rain. And it seems like your pasture goes from an inch of grass to 4 inches of grass, and it looks beautiful. But if that happens, you got to say, oh, that's a big change in the diet of the horse. And we all realize you don't make big changes, for instance, in the grains that you feed your horse. You don't go from a pound of feed to 5 pounds of feed in a meal without expecting some problems. You make those changes gradually. So if you can do that with your pasture grass, it's much more helpful for the horse. Now, laminitis, same sort of scenario here, but there are some different modes of action that can lead to laminitis depending on the individual horse and its sensitivity. So the first one is similar to what we've been talking about, that overload of soluble carbs to the hindgut. So you got the sugar, starches, and especially those fructans that bypass digestion in the small intestine and reach the hindgut. And then the sudden availability of soluble carbs allows increased population of those microbes that ferment soluble carbs and produce lactic acid. And these tend to be gram-negative bacteria, and they rapidly ferment the soluble carbs. Again, the byproduct of this fermentation is lactic acid, which results in a drop in the pH of the hindgut, which is hindgut acidosis. And then this decrease in pH from the increased acids, that actually results in the death of those cellulitic bacteria, which are our normal fiber fermenters. And as these bacteria die, they release endotoxins and reactive amines and exotoxins. And that just all sounds really nasty, doesn't it? And it's going on in the horse's hindgut. And yes, that can result in colic, but also laminitis, because these compounds are thought, there's a lot of research on this and it's not absolutely lined out yet, but the current thought is that the compounds adversely affect the circulation and increase inflammation, and therefore end up destroying the laminar basement membranes in the hooves, causing laminitis. So we've got these sensitive laminae in the inner portion of the walls of the hooves. And when we get destruction, and those laminae can start separating, and that's what actually is laminitis in the horses. It's extremely painful. And it's something, when I was a kid and a horse developed laminitis, that horse was there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. These days, you would want to remove the cause, get with your veterinarian immediately. And there are a lot of things that can be done to help deal with laminitis in the horse. But again, spring grass it is something to be very aware of. Another mode of action that can lead to laminitis, depending on the horse and its sensitivity, would be insulin dysregulation. And you can see this horses with metabolic syndrome, some horses with PPID, pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, or previously known as Cushing's, or just horses that are insulin resistant. They would be more prone to insulin dysregulation issues. And in this case, the consumption of high sugar grasses would cause a rise in blood glucose, which triggers the release of the hormone insulin. And insulin's job is to help regulate the blood glucose by helping to move the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells where it needs to go. However, if the horse is insulin resistant, that mechanism doesn't work. So the insulin is released from the pancreas, but it is not able to help move the blood glucose into the cells. So the pancreas then releases more insulin, and the blood insulin levels continue to increase. And this hyperinsulinemia then triggers alterations in the blood flow to the hooves and boosts the expression of lamella pro-inflammatory cytokines that activate inflammation and alter glucose metabolism within the hoof lamellae, causing laminitis. So in this situation, we don't really know at this point if fructans have, how much of a role fructans and the fermentation in the hindgut really affects this, but we do know that the high levels of sugar and starch in grasses can certainly cause the rise in blood glucose. So, having said all this, moving on to other, basically you could call this a digestive disturbance, but usually it's not nearly as critical for horses as laminitis, possibly colic would be. But still, one of the perils of green grass would be loose manure. And the green grass is very high in water content. Elevated water content of lush green grass can reach up to 85% water. So that's very high water content. And horses go out and graze a lot of green grass, take in a lot of water. And you may see these green cow pies. And a lot of times when you think about it, because I have had horse owners say to me, my horse's stools are really loose, and they often are also very, very green. I say, has your horse just recently been out to pasture? And is your pasture green? Or did your pasture just get rained on and basically regrow and you've got nice new fresh grass again? And yeah, a lot of times this is what's happened. And this usually resolves when the horse adjusts to the new forage or the grass matures a bit and is a little less water content. However, the development of pathological diarrhea is possible. And that's more likely, again, with an abrupt introduction to fresh pasture. And in the dramatic shifts in the hindgut microbiome, same thing we've been talking about, can make the horse actually more susceptible to blooms of pathogenic bacteria that naturally reside in the hindgut. Anytime you have a drastic change to that horse's hindgut microbes, that's not a healthy situation for the horse. You want the microbiome to stay fairly stable in the horse. So basically keep the hindgut bugs happy and you have digestively a healthier horse throughout. So you do want to consult with your veterinarian if drastic changes occur in your horse's stool, especially if it's watery and does not resolve within a day or two. And then the last one we're going to talk about, you might see an increase in wood chewing in these horses because horses do require fiber in their diets. This is not a tremendously well-researched area in horses. We do know they require fiber in their diets. We don't at this point really know exactly how much fiber and the different types of fiber because there are more fermentable fiber, less fermentable fiber, some completely indigestible fiber. But we do know that when the horse's diets are low in fiber, and spring grass, of course, can be very low in fiber, some horses then will start chewing fence boards, trees, or other wood sources. This picture of the fence is from the pasture that my horses live in. And as you can see, it's been addressed because there's a hot wire running across that fence right where the board has been eaten. But it's not really healthy for the horse. They may possibly colic from eating indigestible wood. It could be as a result of impaction, because that, again, indigestible wood can travel through the gut and get kind of hung up because it's not getting broken down by enzymes or by the microbes. Now, keep in mind, horses may also chew wood out of boredom. It's not always a lack of fiber. Sometimes horses start chewing wood and say, oh, this is an interesting way to spend the day. So when you see wood chewing, don't immediately say, oh, there's a problem going on. But you do want to say, why might they be chewing wood? Is it possibly a lack of fiber, or is it a boredom? And if it's a lack of fiber, how do I address this to make sure that the horse is getting all the nutritional support that it needs? Okay, so now that we've talked about all the perils of spring pasture turnout, how do we manage this? First, we got to recognize the forage risk factors. You want to look at the quality and the type of pasture. So be aware if you have cool or warm season grasses, because again, there are kind of differences in the perils of each. You also want to look at your spring weather and be aware of temperatures and the timing and amount of rain. Here in Kansas, it's been a pretty dry spring. And as I mentioned, we've gone from warm temperatures to cool temperatures to warm to cool. And actually in the last couple of weeks, we have had a great increase in the amount of rain. And so the pastures that were just barely greening, right about now, they're just taking off. So for my horses, I've got to be aware, I've got a 35-year-old with PPID, and this guy, I really need to be aware of how much pasture he has access to. And I got to watch him. And I am watching him like a hawk to see if he starts getting ouchy in his feet, because then I will need to pull him off that pasture. You also think about your turnout situation, because one of the nice things is that Mother Nature does a pretty good job of allowing the grasses to grow so the horse's gut gradually gets used to the grass, the greener and more lush pastures, because usually it doesn't just pop out one day. Again, sort of depending on the environment. But if your horse has consistent turnout or pasture time throughout the year, it's usually not as much of an issue, especially if your horse does not have specific sensitivities. However, in many situations, there's restricted turnout to allow that grass to grow and stabilize. I know a lot of barns that do that. They don't turn the horses out on the pastures until the pasture has a chance to really get growing. And those are the times that the horses really have to think about how you're going to get your horse acclimated to that green grass when they finally do get turned out. You also have to think about your individual horse's risk. Again, my old guy, I'm very concerned about. I have a 21-year-old who doesn't really have any risk factors other than he tends to be a bit of an easy keeper. So I kind of think about it for him. And then I have a young guy who's a 5/8 thoroughbred. And as long as he's getting a normal gradual introduction, because he's turned out on the same pasture pretty much same times all year, I'm not as concerned with him. So think about your individual horses, think about what pasture you have, and then manage accordingly. So for your individual horse risk, general health and soundness concerns. How do you figure out how much risk your horse is? First off, evaluate your horse's body condition score. Be aware of the potentials of obesity and metabolic syndrome, because obese horses Horses that suffer from equine metabolic syndrome are more at risk from these digestive disturbances, colic to some extent, but especially laminitis. If your horse has had previous episodes of seasonal colic and or laminitis, then of course you really want to be aware and take this season seriously. And you see the same sort of situations in lush fall grass. So those are the times to be very vigorous on your management. And keep a good eye on those horses and look for any current signs of discomfort, lameness, etc. And then you want to continue to evaluate throughout the introduction to the grazing of the fresh pasture. So day to day, are you seeing any digestive discomfort, any symptoms of colic, any foot soreness, symptoms of laminitis, any changes to body condition score? Because if your horse goes out and just starts mowing down the green grass and really gaining a lot of weight, that is a trigger for you to be aware of and say, do I need to start really monitoring and addressing this grass intake? So body condition scoring is just, if you're not familiar with it, it's an excellent tool. You give a numerical score to each of these circled areas of the horse's body where they tend to store fat. And then you basically take all the scores from all those areas and put them together and come out with the body condition score of your horse. And in general, we want horses to be around a body condition score of 5, which is moderate. And if you go to our website, KER.com, there is a very lovely body condition scoring chart that you can use to help teach yourself how to body condition score. I believe we've even got a video that you can watch, and we're more than happy to help you learn how to body condition score your own horses. As I said before, horses maintained on pasture year-round usually naturally adjust to new grass as it gradually grows. And you can see this is actually a picture of the pasture that my horses go out on. And this was about a week ago, and you can see the grass is not doing all that well. So it's just starting to green up. But again, as this spring rain is coming, the green grass from a week ago to now is different. And in another week, it's going to be much more lush. So be aware of environmental conditions, dry with little to no spring growth, and suddenly torrential rainfall and lush green grass. So for horses at risk, you may still need to manage intake of new spring pasture growth. And as I've mentioned, the problems are most likely to occur when fresh forage is introduced abruptly. So how do you manage that risk? Feeding hay immediately before turnout can help take the edge off the horse's appetite so they don't immediately run out and just, pork down on the nice green grass. Restrict the grazing time and give the horse a gradual introduction to the green grass. So a suggested schedule is 20 to 30 minutes of grazing exposure on the first day of grazing, and then every day or two increase that by 15 to 30 minutes, kind of depending on your horse's risk. And then once the horses are grazing 4 to 6 hours a day total, then the gut is considered acclimated and you can go to regular turnout, whether that turnout is all day or all night or 24/7. Once they're up to about 4 days, they should be good. And the other good tool you can use is a grazing muzzle to slow the consumption of fresh grass. And I will say with my old man, I would love to use a grazing muzzle, but he really doesn't have any incisors left. So if I put a grazing muzzle on him, he can't eat anything. But they are wonderful tools. And here's a picture of some excellent grazing muzzles. I will say personally, I like the idea of the bright green one. I had a halflinger, you will see in a later picture, who always wanted to be obese. And I would put a grazing muzzle on him and he would manage to shuck it every time. And so we got clever and put orange duct tape on the grazing muzzle so we could find it in the pasture once he had taken it off. And one day I went out and I said, oh, there's the grazing muzzle, because I saw all the orange, and went, and the little stinker had figured out how to take the duct tape off his grazing muzzle. So he left the duct tape where I could see it, and the actual grazing muzzle was in a clump of grass on the far side of the pasture. And I know horses are not supposed to be devious and think that way, but this was a Haflinger, and y'all know those ponies. I'll bet he thought like a human. But anyhow, grazing muzzles are excellent tools. So grazing muzzle is an appliance that covers the entire muzzle of the horse and allows only limited intake through a single hole or multiple holes in the floor of the device. I admit, horses usually dislike the muzzles when they're introduced, but they do become accustomed to them. I have had clients that just resisted grazing muzzles, but honestly, a grazing muzzle is so much kinder to the horse than allowing them to get obese, to develop laminitis. Grazing muzzles are great, great tools. Sometimes it's a little tough to fit the grazing muzzle. You want to make sure that there's not too much play, but you do want to have a little bit of space between the horse's lips and then the bottom of the muzzle. You want to leave a width of about 2 fingers between the bottom of the chin and the grazing muzzle. Some horses tend to get rubs from their grazing muzzles, but you can use duct tape and lambskin or synthetic fleece to pad those parts of the muzzle if rubs are a problem. If the horse is a magician at removing the muzzle, as Klinger the Haflinger was, you can put additional straps. And my favorite little tool is to get a Western brow band and throat latch and put that on the grazing muzzle as if it was a bridle. And that can really help to keep the grazing muzzle on. But a lot of the grazing muzzles now, as you see in the picture, this is one that has a lot of options to help get it fitted well, so it's tougher for the horses to get rid of. Do make sure that there is some sort of breakaway, because if the horse gets a grazing muzzle caught on something, you do want it to be able to let go and the horse can get out. And you also want to check daily for rubs or any debris lodged in the muzzle. And one last thing, check the opening on the muzzle, because some of these horses are pretty good at working the hole in the muzzle bigger. And you may think, this muzzle is, I got the muzzle on and my horse is gaining weight on the grass. And then you go look and the horse has made the hole in the mouth part twice as big. These horses are clever. When you use a grazing muzzle, also though, make sure you consider the water source, that it's a water trough, water tub big enough that the horse can still get their muzzle in and drink. Salt intake. At this point, with a grazing muzzle, they're not really going to be able to lick a salt block, so make sure that they do have salt available in their feed or in their stall or otherwise. And even with the grazing muzzle, make sure you monitor body condition score. Some horses actually lose too much weight with a grazing muzzle. And so in those situations, watch if they're gaining weight, make sure the grazing muzzle is limiting intake enough. If they're losing weight, you might want to give them some time off the grazing muzzle, then put it back on. Or sometimes there are different options for the size of the hole at the mouth. So that helps adjust the intake. Some appropriate supplementation. KER has got a couple supplements that can help, especially through these periods. The KER Equisure supplement is a research-proven hindgut buffer. So it helps keep the pH of the hindgut steady, which reduces likelihood of those sweeping shifts in the microbial population due to hindgut acidosis. So it's a great supplement. I gotta say, my young horse that is on Equisure, I was a little worried at one point that he wasn't going to eat it in his feed, and I feed pelleted feed, so the powder can possibly sift through a little bit. So I squirt a little bit of water on it, and he now actually licks the supplement out of his feed pan. So that's just been great. When you have the spring lush grass, you might want to feed the Equisure 2 to 3 times a day, just to make sure you're keeping the pH of the hindgut nice and steady. And you can see in this chart how the Equisure actually affects the pH of the hindgut. And keeps it from having that very acidic situation. KER right track is also an option. Right track is a total digestive tract buffer. It does include Equisure for the hindgut, but it also has ingredients that stabilize and buffer the pH of the stomach, which can help reduce the risk of gastric ulcers. And again, excellent product that has a whole digestive tract effect. So the one last thing I want to talk about, this is Klinger the Halflinger, and you can see, even though this is the best body condition score I could ever keep him, and look at that big, thick, crusty neck, little stinker. But anyhow, there are some nutrients that are typically lacking in even good quality pasture. So if your horse maintains appropriate body weight and condition on the forage, and does not need more calories from feeds, a couple great products are KER all-phase pellet, which is a ration balancing feed. So that's got the protein, amino acids, and then concentrated vitamins and minerals to get all those nutrients that can be lacking in the grasses or the hays. But it's fed in a very small amount. A 1,000-pound horse needs about a pound a day to maintain. And that 1 pound, or about 3 kitchen cups, gets the protein, vitamins, and minerals that they need. Now, if you've got really good quality forage and they're getting adequate protein and amino acids from their forage, and you just want the vitamins and minerals they may be missing, then the KER Micromax is just an excellent balanced vitamin mineral supplement for horses. And I just love this picture of the muzzle with the horse sticking its tongue out. So as you can see, that's the whole of the muzzle. So they can still eat, and I guarantee Klinger could still get plenty of even hay. Even hay, Klinger could get through that whole of the muzzle and maintain his beautiful body weight. So take home message. Remember the spring pasture considerations. You got the increased risk of digestive disturbances, and be aware of your pasture condition and your own horse's individual risks. And then look at the nutrition and management to minimize the risk of digestive disturbances and make sure your horse is getting adequate nutrition. So to minimize the risk of digestive disturbances, gradual turnout, allow that horse's gut to get adjusted to the change in the diet, just as you would with a change in feed. When needed, just make use of grazing muzzles. They're great tools. And look at appropriate supplementation to address the pH changes in the gut and provide the nutrients that may be lacking in the forages. So finally, just to let you know, we do have an April promotion going on at KER. So for Equisure and other digestive health products, it's 15% off for the whole month of April. And you just use the code DIGEST22. So it's really a great deal. And make sure you get the information to enter to win that Tough One Easy Breathe grazing muzzle, because I think just about anybody has at least one horse that can benefit from a grazing muzzle. Thank you very much for your time. Also want to remind you, a really great resource with a lot of articles and information to help you out is our website, KER.com, and we are happy to help you and answer any questions. And also, if you do have questions, please, chat with us, type them in, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have. And I will turn it back over to Erin.
Thanks, Dr. Young. Lots of great tips in there. To wrap up, don't forget to sign up for the drawing for an Easy Breathe muzzle from Tough One. That will close in just a few minutes. So pop down and fill out that form real quick, and you may be the lucky winner. If we didn't get to your question, please email us at info@KER.com, and we will be happy to follow up with you. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in, and thank you to Dr. Young.